Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, the world is facing bloodshed, a refugee crisis, and the knockdown effects of the West's sanctions on Putin and his cronies. Here to break it all down for us is Rafal Rohozinski. He is a principal of SecDev Group. Rafal, thanks again for joining us.
Good to be here, Tony.
So I guess the first question is maybe give us your assessment of where we are now, the Russian progress or lack thereof, West's reactions. Give us a rundown.
Well, I think where we are right now is in a situation where Putin's initial war objectives, which were really going to be a Russian rerun of Gulf War I, a blitzkrieg that would very quickly destroy Ukraine's military power and force some kind of change of regime in Kiev, certainly didn't work out. During the first week of the war, the Ukrainians put up a very, very stiff resistance, causing upwards of 5,000 casualties, now much higher where we are today. And don't forget, these were frontline Russian troops. This was the best of the best. That's $700 billion worth of Russian investment into its military could buy over the last 10 years. The fact that Putin had laid all his cards on the table for this successful operation, and they had not reached their objectives immediately or quickly, and are now bogged down into a long grinding struggle, really puts his presidency and his vision of Russia on the line.
Lots to unpack there, of course. What military analysts are starting to say, obviously, maybe we had a view of the Russian military which was not warranted, that because they had supersonic missiles and all of the technology that money could buy, that this was somehow an invincible force. But they seem to be in a huge logistical jam where they're not able to feed their troops properly or get them the fuel they need, all of these things that are the basic backbone of logistics. Napoleon used to say that it's the soldier's stomach that wins the war. So is that your assessment of things too?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, let's not forget that the Russian military hasn't practiced operations on this scale ever. In fact, even in Soviet times, its largest deployment into Afghanistan was only a fraction of the men and material that they tried to move into Ukraine all at the same time. There's a truth to the fact that the Russian military is brittle. There are pockets of exceptional professionalism, specifically in the special forces and some of the aerospace forces. But for the most part, this is still a conscript army with a retained contractor force that really wasn't ever built for that. The other thing, however, that's here is maybe the hidden war that we're not seeing. And that's the hidden war run by Cyber Command in the US and cyber military cells, which was talked about by David Sanger in the New York Times, that may be wreaking havoc in the background on Russian logistics, exacerbating their own lack of organization with strategic disablement of communication and other cyber strikes that are simply making it difficult for the Russians to operate.
That's a very good point, and it is surprising. We haven't really heard a lot about cyber warfare. We've heard, it's a tenet of modern military strategy that cyber is all part of it, but there hasn't been big news stories about it. But you think underneath that there are things that are happening.
Well, I think, look, there's the big cyber that we talk about on the news all the time. Ransomware hitting companies, critical infrastructure being taken down. These are acts of mass disruption, which we see in peacetime and are quite a big deal. But beyond that kind of activity, which tends to be criminal or in the hacker space, we've had now more than 20 years of serious investment in terms of building cyber capabilities on the military side. And those aren't talked about much for very good reason. But those are undoubtedly part of this conflict on both sides.
Rafal, we're going to take a brief break, but the next question I do want to get into a little bit is the sanctions side of things, because we've seen a series of rolling sanctions, increasing sanctions. The last few days have seen, obviously, the oil and gas sanctions that were not part of the original rollout. And that's certainly true with the US and the UK, not so much Europe yet, but we'll see. But we'll talk about that after the break. So please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm here with Rafal Rohozinski. He is the principal of SecDev Group, talking about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the knockdown effects. Talking about sanctions, obviously, Russia. The term that's being used now is Russia is a pariah state. So, are these sanctions that have been rolling out in successive days and over the last couple of weeks, are they having an effect?
Undoubtedly. In fact, it's difficult to talk about this as sanctions. This is essentially another form or another facet of warfare. There's never been sanctions like this placed on a country as embedded into the global system as we have right now against Russia. The fact that they hit everything and every industry, there's more than 250 companies that are now not doing business in Russia. Its financial system has been crippled. It looks like it's going to be defaulting on its sovereign debt. Moreover, its ability to raise revenue internationally through the sale of oil and gas is now under question, with boycotts and embargoes being put on even by those countries that previously would buy this. So this is a devastating aspect to the war, which is having a real impact, not just on the elites, where I think we were talking about earlier, targeted sanctions, but really on every single Russian. Russians now can't buy foreign currency. They can only take out of the country a very limited amount. Consumer goods are off the shelves, and it looks like the internet soon will start going away, largely because of the fact that those upstream internet providers that used to sell connectivity to Russia are no longer willing to do so because they cannot get paid.
Yeah, it's like the new Iron Curtain in a way, because before the fall of the Soviet Union, uh, there were like two solitudes, right? There was very little interaction economically. But let me say this: I mean, Russia is a huge part of the global economy. Yes, it's 10% of oil and gas, but it's the number one provider of wheat to the world economy, and Ukraine is the number five provider of wheat. So, are we looking at, in terms of the West, Canada, USA, other places, what sort of impacts are these sanctions or this pariah state status of Russia going to have?
Well, I mean, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, these are the unknown unknowns that we're now starting to face. You're absolutely right. You know, globalization and the way that we've come to understand it in the last 31 years as a tightly knit system of supply and demand and supply chains has just been rendered asunder. You're right. You know, the oil and gas component is well known, but Russia's supply of rare earth minerals, titanium, gold, and others, which are critical across all industries, it's going to have tremendous shocks. The only hope we can really have right now, I think, in terms of understanding liability on it, is that this conflict is relatively short, so that some degree of stability in global supply chains can be reasserted. Because otherwise, we're looking at a longer cycle of unpredictable pricing, unreliable supply chains, and a lot of things that we've grown used to suddenly going in a completely different direction. And I think your point about wheat is a really good one. Look, that 80% is wheat that's imported into the Middle East, and that's an area and a region that's already under crisis politically. What happens when prices start spiraling out of control there? You can be looking at another cycle of violence and unrest, besides the one and the mess that we have in Ukraine.
Do you think Russia has crossed a Rubicon, though? I mean, in a sense, there, when you look at Russia, you see an unreliable supplier now. So even if the war on Ukraine ends by some magic, is that assessment going to change, or is it going to be embedded?
Well, it really depends which way the war goes. You know, if we hypothesize on one hand that Russia is successful in Ukraine and we settle back into an old Cold War, then perhaps just like during the Cold War we had trade, that will become the reliable source of trade. If, however, there's blowback in Russia and you start seeing regime change in Moscow rather than in Kiev, then we're in a whole different ballgame. We're back to the early 1990s in terms of what happened in the Soviet Union, which means it'll take, you know, years, if not a decade, before we see some kind of stability. And I'd add here, you know, that Russia is in a unique pariah position now, that it has very few outs. No cargo carrier, meaning ocean cargo carriers, willing to take its transit. Even in China, commodities traders are now basically demanding gold or renminbi as payment. They're not taking any other form of payment for contracts on goods. Really, trade for them has become very difficult, and for that reason, the repercussions for are also going to be significant, because the ability to avoid sanctions is just not there.
Yeah, it has all these effects because it's not just about the relationship with the West. It's really a worldwide issue that they're facing, and basically they're kind of in denial of service mode right now. It's quite a dire situation for them. We're going to get back with Rafal Rohozinski after the break. More to discuss. Stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, with Rafal Rohozinski. He's a principal of SecDev Group. Rafal, I want to talk a little bit about the oligarchs. You know, a lot of, there's these $600 million yachts and Chelsea Football Club and all these high-profile things. But, they were enriched through Putin. Putin was the kind of the sugar daddy for these oligarchs. They can't be happy to have their yachts frozen and all their assets at risk of being confiscated by the UK or wherever. Do you think that this will be an aspect of what Putin has to worry about?
I think so, but maybe not in quite the way that you're capturing it. The oligarchs that emerged in the early 1990s under Yeltsin and in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union are very, very different than those that have managed to stay around under Putin. Putin made a very strong bargain with them, with this new round of oligarchs, and that was keep your nose out of politics and you can keep rich. So essentially what's happened is the oligarchs, which previously had political power also with their money, are now basically bagmen. They're there to be able to distribute discretionary money on Putin's behalf when he needs it without having to go through state coffers. So they're much more compliant than they were before. I'm sure they're exceptionally unhappy with the fact that their properties are being seized and taken in Europe, but ultimately it's what happens to them in Russia that's going to matter. And this is where things get really interesting, because the reality is the Russian government is running out of money. The reserves that they have are going to be in the goodwills of the oligarchs that will be expected to stump up. Are they going to be willing to do that? Are they going to be willing to do that if Putin starts losing popularity because of body bags coming home and the Russian economy tanking? That's a really interesting question. And I think at that stage in the game, these oligarchs will once again become kingmakers in terms of whatever comes next.
What about the generals? These and the security agencies. The security agencies, you can say a lot about them, but the one thing they do know is what it's really like in the West and what's really going on in Ukraine and so on. Is that a threat to Putin in the future, do you think?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And we've seen a couple of indications that all is not well in the Kremlin house starting to emerge. First of all, it's pretty clear that the FSB and especially the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, was not very happy and was not necessarily in step with the momentum towards this war. In fact, the National Security Council meeting that Putin held in public, highly staged a few days before the war, essentially had the humiliation of the chief of the Foreign Intelligence Service, who was asked several times, are you supportive of the fact that we need to bring independence for the two republics in Ukraine, Donetsk and Lugansk? And he stuttered a couple of times and was called on the carpet. The invasion of Ukraine is very much led by the military. And I think the issue there is that they may have overstepped on their hubris in terms of telling Putin something that could be delivered, which a lot of others in the security community did not think was the case. We'll see exactly where this lands, but certainly that unity between the security and the military apparatus is not there. And it's a potential cleavage line that will exacerbate and widen as this conflict grinds on.
Just turning back to the response of the West, are you surprised that you mentioned 250 companies that have basically done their own sanctions? I think of KPMG that is moving, they're closing down an office that had 4,500 people in it and that kind of thing. Are you surprised by that kind of response?
I'm not. I'm not, because I think everyone was not expecting that Putin would take such a maximalist role on Ukraine. As we were scenarioing this out, for example, with some of our clients, we were looking at a limited military incursion, something that would occupy Donetsk and Lugansk in order to create pressure on the Ukrainian government to move forward with Minsk II. But the idea that the Russian military would seek to invade and hold all of Ukraine certainly wasn't there. That move in of itself, I think, crossed so many red lines, along with the nuclear flag waving that Putin did alongside of it, basically saying any interference will be met with potentially a nuclear response, that there was just no way that any company could maintain business as usual in Russia.
And we're seeing the results of that as we continue on. Is Russia getting out of the sanctions in some way? Are they getting around them? Trying to do that?
No, I mean, for the moment, it looks like they're not. As I mentioned, the number one country to which it could turn in order to evade sanctions is China, with which it has significant trade, including in oil and gas, a land border, which means that they're not dependent on any other kind of transport. But the problem has come down to capital markets. Who is going to issue letters of credit? What currency is going to be used in order to denominate the transactions? And then what happens to these goods once they go onto the market?
Rafal, we're back. Yeah, please continue with your thought. Yeah.
Sure. No, we were talking about Russia evading sanctions. And one of the things that's also coincidentally now happening at the same time is the possibility of an Iran nuclear deal. Why that's significant is because if Iran nuclear deal does go through, we're going to see Iranian oil back on the market, which of course takes any incentive of reselling Russian oil and gas through China off the table, putting additional pressure on them from a sanctions and fiscal point of view. So.
Yeah, and to complicate matters, Russia is, I guess, a signatory or a partner in that original nuclear deal. So, are they going to try to gum up the works if there's a deal to be had for the U.S. and Iran?
I think to the extent that we can be looking at the Iranians acting in good faith, this is probably the strategic break that they were looking for in terms of finding some kind of accommodation and out of the sort of corner that they had been backed into over the nuclear question. So I'd say that Russia's influence on that would probably come secondary to Iran's strategic interests in seizing this moment.
Interesting stuff. How does this affect prices at home? Obviously, we were talking about oil and we were talking about wheat and food. Do you see this as a longer term issue or a short term issue?
Well, I think right now the markets are reacting on the short term, which is the level of risk and the disruption to supply chains. The longer term perspective is obviously going to depend on the trajectory of the conflict. Are we looking at a long conflict? Are we looking at a short conflict? Are we looking at one in which Russia comes out as effectively a new Cold War power, or one where we're back to the 1990s because there's a regime change in Moscow? So I think there's a lot of unknowns right now. Markets don't like unknowns, so we're going to see price spikes in the short term. The long term is going to depend on the supply chain. And there's a number of things that are already in play. I mean, for example, now is the time of year where Russia traditionally will sell its winter stocks of corn and wheat. Those aren't going on the market, which means invariably we're going to start seeing prices going up. In a month's time, it's planting season in Ukraine. So unless we have some kind of wind down of these particular hostilities, we can see a massive disruption over the next 12 months, as essentially the supplies from Ukraine are not be able to meet the market, go onto the market, and neither are those coming from Russia. So there's a lot of knock-on effects here we need to look at.
Where do you see China in all this? So obviously, they've got this strategic alliance, if you will, with Russia. They can't be happy, though, with their ally doing so poorly on the battlefield and creating this worldwide reaction and instability.
Well, by all accounts that we've heard, President Xi of China was taken by surprise by the invasion. Now, whether this is true or not, the reality is that what Putin has done essentially has violated a principle that China has tried to uphold many, many times in the UN, and that's the principle of national territorial sovereignty.
Right.
The reason for that is that China's claims over Taiwan aren't that they want to incorporate a sovereign country, but rather that they want to reassert their own sovereignty over a country that they consider, or a territory they consider their own. So the fact that they're now in a position of having to defend effectively their ally invading a sovereign state puts them in a very tenuous position, and certainly much more cautious than we would expect them to be, given the sort of brotherly love previously expressed by Putin and President Xi.
That on the diplomatic side, absolutely true. Do you think that they're going to be drawn into, more financial assistance for Russia and buying more oil and gas from Russia, these kinds of things?
Well, I mean, look, the reality is that China is already a major client of Russian oil and gas. In fact, the Freedom of Siberia pipeline, which is just completed, effectively cemented that. And I think it's part of a longer term partnership for China to secure energy sources that don't require transshipment around the world, and for Russia to basically diversify its trade away from export just to Europe through the pipeline system. So from that point of view, I think there's a net benefit to China. The degree to which sanctions are going to make Russia dependent on consumer goods or even industrial goods from a friendly country over the long term, a longer term, yeah, I think that certainly China will come out on top in that respect. There's an interesting story to be told in high tech as well, because the reality is these sanctions are also effectively withdrawing from Russia simple things like internet connectivity, access to high tech software and tools. And the only real alternative market here is China. So China may actually take the sweeps here by effectively creating a vassal state out of Russia from which it draws raw minerals and to which it exports high-tech goods.
On that note, Rafal Rohozinski, we've got to call it a day. Lots to talk about. I'm sure there'll be another opportunity, but thanks for joining us today.